Well, good afternoon if you are in New York City or Connecticut or Sao Paulo, or good morning if you're in some place like Carmel, California, or Monterrey, Mexico, or good evening if you are in Paris or St. Petersburg or any capital of culture anywhere in the world. Greetings and special love to our loved ones in Ukraine. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all over the world. I guess that makes me Fred Plotkin, and I'm happy to be with you. I'm very happy to welcome someone that I think many of you in the audience may not know unless you've seen him on stage, but everybody on Planet Opera and everybody in the music profession who is anybody knows. Craig Rutenberg is my old friend. He is what I describe as a musician's musician. When we look, and I'm not a musician, I'm trained, but I'm not a performing musician. When we look to people for guidance, for knowledge, for their sense of what works musically, what is of value, what are the values that we want to imbue in our music making, one of the people we always turn to is Craig Rutenberg. So Craig, welcome.
Thank you very much, Fred. Thanks for inviting me, and it's a real pleasure to be here.
Sure. So I think, I've never asked this of my other guests, but I'm going to ask this of you because it's a trite question, but it's an important one. How did you start with music?
Frankly, it was always around. Uh, I, I remember reacting to music of all sorts, whether it was my grandmother's 78s of Kirsten Flagstad singing or UC Björling singing because, or if it was Rosemary Clooney singing This Old House on the radio. I always had a visceral reaction to it. So I can't remember life without music.
I think you'll understand this question. Did you feel music within you?
Yes, both rhythm and sound. I certainly, like most little kids, toddlers, responded to rhythm immediately. And kids dance, as soon as they could learn to move. But what I particularly remember is a red plastic 33 and a third of the Longines Sinfonietta
Mm.
playing Wotan's Farewell, just an orchestral
Wow.
version. I have no
From the
idea.
Valkyra.
Yeah, I have no idea who brought it into the house or why it was there. But I remember as a 4 or a 5 year old sitting listening to it and bursting into tears. And my grandfather coming in and saying, nimm die Musik weg, get rid of the music. There's something wrong with the child. Ist etwas los mit dem Kind. That's how it all started.
um, do you happen to remember the first music you danced to? I remember mine very vividly. It was the Haydn Trumpet Concerto, and it was on a recording, and I just jumped up and started moving. And I had no idea what that music was. I didn't know what the trumpet was. I didn't know who Haydn was at the time, but there was something that made me leap out of my crib practically and start moving around.
You had infinitely more class than I did with learning.
But I mean, it's important because, and I'm going to leap many topics and then we'll go back to this. You and I both knew Maestro James Levine very well and got to work with him closely. And I had the great privilege, because I was not in the music department at the Met. I was in management, I was in production somewhat, but I was not on the music staff. But he's the person who recommended that I be hired at the Met, and I was hired by Anthony Bliss. And I think he recognized that although I was, quote, managerial, that I was also musical and had interest in knowledge. And at a certain point, I asked him if I could have the benefit of his knowledge to ask questions if I had want to know something. And it turned into something very formal and structured that every month I had an hour with him, and I got to come to his office and sit down with him for many years, even after I left the Met, and in effect ask him whatever I was thinking about musically. And he would give me these brilliant answers. As I'm sure you know, he would often hear the question, answer for 45 minutes with all kinds of brilliant digressions, and then get back to and answer my original question. And then I would say, okay, we have 15 minutes left. But one thing among the many, many things he said to me that always stuck with me, because my father, who was a musician, said the same thing, that he always had music in his head.
Yeah.
No matter what was going on, there was music playing. So he could be eating dinner and he'd have music in his head. He could be at a play, he could be in a conversation with other people and have music in his head.
Sure.
And one time when he said that to me, I said, what do you have in your head now? He said, the Brahms German Requiem. We were not talking about Brahms in any way. We were talking about the Mozart 40th Symphony, which is something that I was studying at the time and had the benefit of his knowledge about it. But while he simultaneously spoke brilliantly to me about the Mozart 40th Symphony, in his head, he was playing the Brahms Requiem, which is a phenomenon. I mean, I've never had earbuds and Walkman and the modern equivalents. I don't need to play music in my head. I have it there, but I can switch it off. What about you?
I can't. There's always something going on. And occasionally Jim would pose that question, what are you listening to now?
Uh-huh.
And he didn't mean, what are you listening to when you go home from the bedroom? What's playing in your head now?
Right. And did he do that? And then you would reply whatever the work was. Did he then pick up the conversation about that work, or he just took in your answer and went on?
Both. Sometimes he would just say, very often it was Poulenc. I have a great deal of Poulenc in my memory bank.
Mm-hmm.
And I tend to hear a lot of the songs, some of the orchestral music. And, and he would just say, okay. And then he'd move on to something else.
Why Poulenc? And then we're going to get back to some of my original questions, but why Poulenc?
His music hits the nerve. It
Mm-hmm.
just hits that vibration within me. And I've never been able to or never wanted to shake it.
When I talk about this phenomenon with people in music or not, I refer to it as like having a blood type that or a particular heartbeat. I have a dear friend in Sweden who's a wonderful, very cultured man, but he always says to me, and he means it, that he doesn't have the Mozart gene, that for whatever reason, he does not, there's nothing that happens in his body and in his mind when he hears Mozart, which I feel sorry for, but, you know, I've been with him and he responds to very magnificent music, rarefied music, but there's just something about Mozart that he doesn't have. I have two composers, Berlioz and Rossini, for whom I react constantly, and I feel Rossini is my heartbeat and Berlioz is my blood. And I've never actually put it that way before, but that's what I feel.
Chapeau.
And merci. And it's really I get it. And if I hear either of their works, their music, I'm just everything else freezes and I'm just back in their music again. There are composers that I don't necessarily thrill to in the same way. And James Levine, one time we were in discussion. I wrote a book, people know my Opera 101. I wrote a book called Classical Music 101, a complete guide to learning and loving classical music. And when I completed the book, I brought it to him and he read the manuscript and had a lot of nice things to say. And he says to me, okay, I have a question for you. which composer did you not get or not feel before writing the book that now is indispensable? And I quickly answered Franz Schubert. And he
Wow.
said, that's absolutely right. Because it's not that I don't use the word appreciate, couldn't feel Schubert and his music before, but somehow in the study and the growth process of writing that book, Schubert came to the fore completely. And I think that he's a composer that, while magnificent, is not easy. He makes
No,
it easy,
no,
but
not at
he's
all.
not. Yeah.
I remember reading Brendel saying somewhere, it's not the sweet, sugary operetta type melody with which he's often portrayed. There are a lot of craggy mountains in the Austrian landscape, and that's what Schubert is all about. And he
Yeah.
was right.
Yeah. So part of this is that it leads to a term that you and I and other people know well, a life in music, in that we build relationships with these composers, with these works that go on and on. In my case, more in opera, where there might be operas that when I was younger didn't do anything for me and now are indispensable. Whereas there are other operas that perhaps I loved when I was 15 or 20 that now I can take or leave. And as we grow and change, I don't know what do you think? Does the music grow and change, or it's just us and that the music is an absolute?
The music is an absolute. We grow and change, and thank God we do. One of the first complete opera albums I bought was Die Meistersinger. And it was the old Klapperswitch recording with Schlöffler, Güden, and Crowd. And I listened to it and I learned it. And then for quite some time, I can't say I went off it, but I lost interest in it. I remember hearing a performance in January of 1968 in Altenburg, outside of Leipzig in Germany. I was over there with Friedel Wagner, and they gave a performance of Meistersinger in her honor. What was I then? 15, 16, 15. And I remember being enthralled by it because it was a gem of an old theater that had been untouched by the Second World War. It was Wieland Wagner's production from 1942 or 43. They had still kept it around. But I remember it being a very long evening. Shortly before Jim died, I asked him if any music made him cry, and he said, there are parts of Meistersinger which make me cry always. And I thought, oh, how interesting. And it just so happens that now online, I have been helping a great number of singers and a company with the production of Die Meistersinger, which has just gone up. It's the Mariinsky. And I have to say, I have found myself shockingly shedding more tears at certain points than I ever thought I would. So it's my growth over 55 years, I'm 70 now, how the music and the words of Meistersinger hit. So it's we who change.
Well, actually, that was my next question regarding specifically Meistersinger. And for you and for James Levine, if you know, is it the music or is it the words?
Yes,
Okay.
it's everything. It's everything. It's everything. It's as a coach, I have finally come to realize and to teach that if a composer knows what he or she is doing, then you really must start with the text, the rhythm of the text, the colors of the text. Uh, then I was discussing this with Maestro Levine one day, and he said, yes, of course, that's where it starts. And you see how the words influence the music. But then conversely, if you're intelligent enough, you see how the music influences the words.
Yeah.
That's how you work. You always have to work from both directions. Once you've figured out where the text goes and you've tried to help a young singer understand where the words are coming from and what they mean and their weight, their movement, their flow. Do you remember an Italian coach at the Met who was there for a couple of years called Ubaldo Gardini?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Oh, Ubaldo, he was just the greatest. He was the greatest, Florentine in his beautiful suits and silk shirts and tight neckties. And a minute into the coaching, he'd be sweating and he'd be loosening his shirt and everything already. But it was always about the words and the rhythm and the inflection of the words first. I remember playing a coaching at the old London Opera Centre. It must have been 1979, 1980 at the latest. And he was working with a terrific young British baritone, bass baritone, on the first scene of the second act of Falstaff. And we must have spent 15 minutes on buongiorno, buon, buon, buon. And even though I had a minor in Italian from Georgetown in the early 70s, no one had ever pointed out to me how important the U before it, the O, was. And my world just completely changed that afternoon, listening to Ubaldo, sweating and gyrating and all of that, but explaining to Robert how it was buongiorno. It was life-changing.
So with that, and the libretto was by Arrigo Bowie, tone music, of course, Giuseppe Verdi. Do you think that Verdi responded to the way Bowie set the text? What brought out the musical moment that Verdi wrote that was based on the text?
Yes, he was very much inspired and encouraged by it. And just think of the notes. It's a perfect musical translation of the
Yeah.
beautiful Italian language. Buongiorno, buona donna. I can't get any better.
I want to go back to you and then to your musical roots. This is a bit of a digression, but you'll understand where I'm going. One of my great musical figures of all was Aretha Franklin, and I like to call myself an Arethaologist. And I studied her life and her music making endlessly and tried to remove the regular stories that were told from what I found in her music, because what struck me always about Aretha Franklin was her musicianship and her singing, but her piano playing and everything. And she wrote a memoir with a co-author called From These Roots. And to me, the last part of the book was not so great. She was sort of settling scores with people. But the first part of the book was about her musical influences and how it was not simply the gospel, the Black church. It was not simply soul music. It was everything. And how she would hear these things and integrate them into her own music making. She loved Irving Berlin, for example, and therefore could hear his rhythms and cadences and humor and jokes and introduce them all of a sudden in her singing and piano playing. How, if we're to talk about you're building your musical house and the bricks that you laid and the mortar that you put down, how did that happen? And what were some of the, or I've never used this metaphor before, but the way Aretha described her From These Roots, what did you build with and what was built for you, so to speak?
I was a very lucky little guy. My maternal grandmother unfortunately died 3 years before I was born,
Mm.
but she left behind piles of 78s of great singers singing operatic repertory. She'd apparently been a very good pianist, but after her death, the family thought, oh, we're never going to need a piano again. So they got rid of
Oh.
her opera. Yeah, exactly. However, growing up in New Haven, Connecticut, in the house next door to us lived her brother, who was a fellow called Fred, but Fritzi Cadil. And he was a pianist as well. And indeed, he was the pianist in Milone, not Malone, Milone's Tavern in downtown New Haven, when Rudy Valley was a student at Yale and played for Rudy Valley, and also with the Ponzillo sisters, Carmen and Rosa Poncel, used to be driven into New Haven from Meriden, Connecticut. So he played for them until Rosa went off to do her Met audition and became a star. I think Carmen kept coming in and singing at the bar after that. Anyway, he was there and he had a Steinway baby grand. So I would, you know, toddle over next door and Fritzy would be watching television and I'd sit down and start to play notes, make some noise, and his wife would say, shh, your uncle is listening to the television. And he'd say, shut up, Rosie, let the kid do what he wants. And that's how it started.
Mhm.
Family legend is, I don't quite believe it because I'm not that smart, but family legend has it that was shortly after my third birthday, he started teaching me how to read music and where that went on the piano. Certainly by the age of 4, I could read music and do that. And that's how it all started. I also heard some incredible singers on the Ed Sullivan Show. Remember when that used to happen? Well, you're younger than I am, but when great opera singers used to appear, and I particularly remember Risa Stevens, Jussi Björling, and Hilde Guden.
Mhm.
And I just went crazy over the sound of the human voice doing this. And then I was able to connect it to the 78s that my grandmother had left behind. I didn't know him very well because he died when I was so young. But apparently, my paternal grandfather, a Russian Jewish emigre called Max Rutenberg, uh, also loved opera. And he, according to my father, always listened to the Saturday Texaco broadcast. So genetically, something was being passed on that way.
And did you grow up listening to the Saturday broadcasts?
Boy, did I ever. Once my mother introduced me to that, everyone's Saturday afternoon was ruined because I had to hear a radio, or if we were visiting relatives or friends, I had to be sitting in the corner listening to the radio from about the age of 8 on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, Nowadays, it's not a given that young people in America and elsewhere hear the Met or other Saturday broadcast of opera. But in our time, it was a given that that was possible.
Oh,
And
yeah.
here in New York City, where I grew up, we have had and still have radio station WQXR that was carrying the Met broadcast live from the stage of the Metropolitan Opera House. And for a time, WQXR was the radio station of the New York Times. And you would have news coverage being read to you, and then you'd have the broadcast. And my family tradition was that my dad and I would spend Saturdays together. Dad was a musician, and he would take me in the morning to the orthodontist and then go visit my grandmother. And at that time, the opera usually began at 2. And my grandmother would prepare lunch, and my dad would go. He would go do errands and so forth. And I would stay with my grandmother, who was born in Belarus. And she would say to me, now this girl is named Mimi, and she's cold. And so she comes up, and there's this guy, his name is Rodolfo, and she has a candle, and she would basically tell me what was happening. So my way into opera, and I think the reason that I came in on the production side and the staging side was that to me, these were stories with music. I
Mhm.
certainly came to embrace the music, but every single action that my grandmother narrated, and she somehow knew all these works, even though she'd never been, but she knew them all. And not, simply the Traviatas and Toscas and Bohems, but she knew Faust, she knew Lohengrin, she knew, I don't know how. And, she would say, well, he's arriving now on a swan. What do you mean he's arriving on a swan? Well, you have to picture it. It's not a real swan. And all of this feeding of my imagination happened with the Saturday broadcast.
Sure.
And I became what I call a stage director in my head,
Mhm.
that I pictured action, I pictured movement and gesture and emotion through the music. And I say this because you, I imagine, were completely captivated by all the musical fundamentals that you profoundly understand, that I can feel and I can to some degree comprehend, but not to the degree that you do. And I'm saying this as an example to our listeners that there are many ways into this magnificent music.
Oh,
And
yeah.
as
We would.
Levine
Oh,
said, and as I agree 100%, it's music first and the words and the action. But it's music first. You agree or no? Or no?
of course, the music is what grabs us, particularly if we're newbies. But once the opera claws are in our souls, then of course we start to study the stories and the words. And then it becomes a 50-50 proposition as far
Mm-hmm.
as I'm concerned. You just can't have one without the other.
Yeah.
But those Saturday afternoon Texaco broadcasts gave an education to so many of us. Oh, it was an incredible time.
Now, Craig, when I proposed you and I have this conversation, I completely forgot what is obvious to you and to me, but I forgot it, that I appeared on these broadcasts very often with you.
That's right.
I did you remember? Because I really forgot.
Well, no, because I was never on the panel. I was always at the piano.
Right.
Yeah,
You were playing what were called musical identifications, and to
it,
me, it sounded like a complete blur and gibberish because
not at all.
you know
Not
that
at all.
11 million people at least are listening, and you have to, identify a motive from, Fedora that was not at the top of my list of music that I was listening to at the moment. Um, it was very talk. I mean, we should go through there now because you refer to them correctly as the Texaco broadcast. This was the oldest and most enduring corporate sponsorship of the arts in America and perhaps the world. And it began, I remember the date, I wasn't there, nor were you, December 24th, 1940, with a performance of Le Nozze di Figaro. And after that, Texaco presented throughout the almost the entire opera season the broadcasts that were heard first nationally and then internationally. And the sponsorship went on, I'm guessing, somewhere into the 1990s. I don't remember exactly when. Um, and then it was taken over by Toll Brothers and now other people. And we thank everybody who underwrites the arts. But what was unique was that there were millions of Americans who, when they were out driving in their cars, would pass a service station to buy gasoline, petrol. And if it was Esso, Exxon now, or Mobil, they would keep driving until they came to a Texaco.
Oh,
Because
sure.
they wanted to support the company that supported the Metropolitan Opera.
I came back to the States in 1980 after a period in Europe to join the staff of the Houston Grand Opera. And I had a diesel Volkswagen Rabbit. And it wasn't always so easy to find diesel fuel. And I would always be looking. Finally, I found a Texaco. station, and I pulled in, and the guy who was filling up the tank said, "So where are you working?" And I said, "At the Opera House." And he said, "Oh, don't we give money to some opera place around the world?" I mean, even the grease monkey, as we used to call them, knew. Yeah.
Well, Texaco was taken over by Chevron, which is Northern California based. And the bean counters, the people who did the money at Chevron, and I knew someone within Chevron, and I got this directly, decided that they didn't want to support anything that was not Northern California based. So they gave up the support. It costs $7 million a year, which is a few barrels of oil.
Yeah.
For this prestige, for this cultural support, for everything that it did. And I'm saying this because I want enlightened corporate people, and there are many of them out there, to understand that supporting the arts is good for your community, but all communities. It supports education. It does all kinds of things for very little expense for a big company.
Mm-hmm.
And Chevron simply tossed all of that prestige away that Texaco had built over many decades.
Yeah. Pretty shameful, pretty tragic.
So now now that I had forgotten or suppressed, now I want to talk about what was it like to appear on intermission features of the Texaco Metropolitan Opera International broadcasts? Because you were one of the maestros who frequently performed live internationally, intermission being interval for people in the UK. Where between the acts there would be a time frame where we would gather in List Hall, which is an auditorium of 144 seats, and sometimes there would be a panel. I was on them. Sometimes I would present an essay. Sometimes there was the opera quiz, and I was one of the people being quizzed. And often you would play musical selections. How were they planned ahead? How did you know? Talk about that, because I was not allowed to ask because I was a panelist. So now I can ask.
Sure. Usually the Monday of before the Saturday broadcast, Will Berger would come to my office and say,
Producer, yep.
"Yeah, this is what the subject is, and I've got 15 selections. Out of these, which 3 or 4 do you think are the best?" And we talk about it. Then he would take it back to his colleagues, his superiors. And usually by Thursday, a decision was made which excerpts were going to be used, and I would just practice them, or whoever was playing would practice them. And that's how it came to pass. But I have to tell you, the first time I played was exciting beyond words, but totally nerve wracking.
Mm-hmm.
Because here I was doing something that I couldn't have dreamt about as a kid or a teenager.
Yeah. Now, another question relating to that is, you had I guess it was a baby grand piano in the theater, or was it a grand piano?
In List Hall, oh, it was
In List Hall.
Yeah, it was very much a grand piano.
Okay. And this, I and my fellow panelists sat relatively near the piano. When I'm attending performances, I don't sit that near a piano. And between that and I wasn't very nervous, but there were nerves. It doesn't sound like what it sounds like when you're listening at home because of the proximity of the piano, but also the pedal. Did you play differently because you were being on the radio, or how did you have to adjust the sound?
If I adjusted the sound, it was only trying to imitate the sound of instruments in the orchestra as best I could. But I really felt for you folks sitting at the desk, because there you are, verbally exposed in front of the world, the English-speaking world, and you're on the spot. And I always think of Terry McEwen, from Decca Records, who knew more about opera than almost anyone I ever knew. And I think he told me that he missed something like 10 questions over the years, confusing Aida with Ballo and Ballo with Forza and all. I
Sure.
mean, he knew this stuff inside out, but under the pressure of the moment, he would just go someplace else. And I thought, these poor people sitting there, I hope they know what I'm playing, but can they concentrate well enough under pressure to name it?
I would often say, as Terry McEwen would have, well, that is Verdi. And then occasionally, not often, they would say, well, no, that was Leoncavallo. Oh, it was early Leoncavallo. The point was, we who were on the radio had to, we hope, be smart and entertaining and accurate, but it was live radio. We could not be silent. And the host, who at that time was often Edward Downes, not always. And then in later years in the Peter Gelb era, we'd have rotating hosts, and then we would have a guest artist in addition to the host. And I was on the first broadcast of the Peter Gelb era, and the host and artist all in one was Beverly Sills. And we were all trying to feel our way because Beverly Sills was a great professional, but it was all new. And Beverly, for all the hosting that she had done of radio programs, had not hosted an opera quiz. And she would, read the question, and then she would say, well, I don't know this. It's not a role I did, which I would take as a hint. Okay, it's not Violetta. It might be me. But you have to be entertaining and not be stupid. And obviously you cannot use bad language, which we didn't do. There was a certain kind of decorum, a certain kind of propriety, and not say stuffiness, but the broadcast had a tone. And people
had such a tone. And it was such a tone of being proud of what we knew and what we wanted to bring to the listening audience. It was class. It was really,
in a way, also, it was New York. The way programs such as Ed Sullivan and What's My Line, for Americans who would know this, shows in New York that expected talent, but also a certain degree of wit and sophistication, and something that was not found back in many towns, where people would hear it and aspire to come to New York to see a Broadway show, to attend a play, to go to the Metropolitan Opera, to hear the New York Philharmonic.
Sure. Well, people like you, Father Owen,
Owen Lee,
Owen Lee, who was so intelligent and so erudite on the radio. Ted Downs, of course, was a walking encyclopedia. And you folks were to the opera quiz what people like Arlene Francis or Bennett Cerf were to What's My Line. There was
or Soupy Sales. I was more than Soupy Sales.
The first time I played on a broadcast, and I don't remember what the theme was, but I remember I had to play the beginning of the sleepwalking scene from Macbeth. And sitting on the panel was Alberta Maiziello, a great coach and a legend in New York among musicians, opera singers. She had been on the staff of the Met forever and ever until just before that. I'd never met her before. I only knew her as a legend. And I remember I started to play the and I heard this from the panel table. And it turned out that it was just recognition from her. But I thought, oh, dear God, have I played so badly? And when the entire broadcast was over, when the intermission broadcast was over, I was getting up at the piano and she looked at me and she said, A. And I thought, oh, I'm in for it. I am so in for it. And I walked over there and I said, how do you do, Maestro? It is a pleasure and an honor to meet you. And she said, you play really well.
In a way, was perhaps the most famous of the quiz panelists.
Yeah.
There were a few, but she had a gravelly voice, and she was middly, but she kind of spoke like this.
She did.
And her voice was that was not so good. I remember better when Tibaldi sang it. That was good.
Yeah.
And she was more opinionated, openly opinionated than the rest of us, where we would invest our comments with opinions, but in a more Arlene Francis kind of way, such as, I've never quite heard it sung that way before. It could be moderable.
Right. But you can imagine what I was feeling when she said that.
Yeah.
You. Oh, God.
Let's actually, I mean, Craig, I had no plan. I didn't write plans for you, but I had no plan to go down the opera quiz and the intermission broadcast routes, but it's very valuable. And we'll go to many other things as well. Um, Father Owen Lee was a fascinating figure. He was from Toronto, and he was a Catholic priest, and he was a professor. And he was an opera lover and expert, but especially the Ring Cycle. And he wrote a book called, I believe, Turning the World Around. I think that was the title or
Sounds
something.
right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And he was fascinating and very genteel. But I know that and I'm sure I'm not the only one, felt inhibited. It was not a thing of his fame or knowledge, but that how do I talk to him about Zygmunt and Sieglinde, who are brother and sister, having sex? He was a Catholic priest. And I tiptoed around a lot of operatic subject matter. You know, I would refer to Violetta and her work.
Her night job.
Tosca and her relationship with Mario, rather than normally say that this is who they are, what they do. And, frankly, I think most opera lovers, maybe not Zygmunt and Sieglinde, but they accept Tosca's work and a lot of the other professions as being part of life. But he was in no way fussy, or he in no way imposed the value system of his being a priest. And he was fascinating because he would discuss morality in Wagner, not from a Catholic point of view, but from a Wagnerian point of view. Did you get to talk to him much at all?
Unfortunately, no. And I wish I had. There are several people no longer with us now, and I so wish I'd had the courage and the intelligence to ask questions, but I didn't.
For example, whom?
Well, he was one. I wish I had thought more of questions to ask Maestro Levine. I used to spend a lot of time with Bernard Haitink at Glyndebourne in the summers. I wish I'd asked him so much more about Beethoven and Mahler. He asked me more questions than I asked him. I played rehearsals for him, but I didn't quite know how to formulate things. He, on the other hand, heard from someone at Glyndebourne when I first went there in 1979 that I baked my own bread because in the late 70s and the early 80s, if you weren't able to get to London and shop at Harrods, bread was pretty awful. I mean,
Yeah.
you could get a bloomer loaf or you could get a wholemeal, but there was something else. You couldn't get French bread. And one day he came up to me after a rehearsal of La Fedeltà Premiata of Haydn,
Mhm.
when Glyndebourne thought they were going to go down the Haydn path. And he said, Craig, is it true that you bake your own bread? I said, yes, it is, Maestro. He said, could I come and watch? And I said, well, of course you can come and watch, but it starts at 6:30 in the morning. He said, tell me, I'll be there. And sure enough, a couple of days later, he rode up. He was on his bike. He parked it outside of the kitchen window of the house. In those days, some of the staff stayed in the big Christie house. And he came in, and I explained to him about making the Polish the day before. And then we started. And every time there was a break in rehearsal, we'd hightail it back into the staff kitchen of the house and do another step of the bread.
Hmm.
I mean, that Bernard Haitink wanted to watch me make bread was one of the great honors of my existence on this planet.
I can imagine. I'm going to make one more comment about the broadcast because I think it's important listeners know, and then we're going to leave the broadcast. one of the reasons perhaps that you didn't speak with some of the people that I spoke with is that they were very rigorous, and correctly so, about separating the musical talent from the panelists and performers. And I was in the panelist performer side, and you were the musical talent. And I never knew who was going to play. You would appear, or someone else would appear. But we really were kept in the dark entirely. In fact, we were given a lunch before, and we were kept separate from everyone so that we had no idea what we were going to face.
Nope.
And that's as it should be. And, you know, in my very long experience as a panelist at the Met broadcast, they were very rigorous about separate. There was no feeding us of lines. There were no hints. There was no nothing, which is as it should be. But that's why in that whole period, I obviously knew who you were and you knew who I was. We never spoke in that context. And even after the fact, if I saw you, we didn't talk about the quiz that I was on because I was not allowed. And you probably were told, don't talk to them about any of this.
No, I was never instructed to do anything like that.
Okay.
But I was sort of a very shy jerk. So I kept away from a lot of people. I wish I'd known you better when we were both in the house all those years ago. But I know I never knew who the panelists were going to be until Saturday when I would get down, and there was always a tryout, and whoever the guest host was would be there. You know, it could be Signora Scotto, or it could be, I don't know, it could be anyone. And I would get out and I would play a lot of examples, and then she would get the rhythm of it, the feel of it. I would feel a little bit better. We never used the real questions, the real musical examples. But no, I was just sort of very nerdy, not needy, nerdy.
I understand.
That's why I kept my distance as well.
So now I'm going to take you back to you built the roots and the foundations. What was your first professional job, and how did you wind up on the route to being a coach and a pianist, and how did you wind up in Europe early on as you were born and grew up in America?
All right. The same great uncle, my mother's uncle, Fritzi Kniel, who taught me to read music, it was my first piano teacher, was also the first person to mention to me, you know, singers need people to help them learn their roles. And you may want to do it, you may not want to do it when you grow up, but that's something you might want to think about. I mean, he planted a very big seed there. Uh, I also, my mother was German Lutheran, my father was Jewish. As it turned out, and as I always suspected, my mother was Jewish as well.
Huh.
But her grandmother had come over to the States in 1876. After my mother's death in 2005, I found a wooden box which had a lock. And my cousin, who was the only other relative on that side, said, I think you better open this. I don't think this is for me. So we opened it, and it hadn't been opened since 1937.
Wow.
And in it was, in my great grandmother's absolutely spidery script, the history of the family.
Wow.
She was a Schlegel. She
Mm-hmm.
was a cousin of Friedrich Schlegel. At the time of the first attempt at German unification, around the time of Meistersinger, 1863, 1864, she converted from Judaism to Catholicism.
Yeah.
When she came to the United States in 1876, she figured out that it was better to be a German Lutheran than a Catholic, and made the change again. She was a very clever lady. I wish I had known her. She must have had such courage and determination. God, I wish I had known this woman.
Yeah.
But it was that through that change in her religious affiliation that I would go and hear beautiful Lutheran hymns on Sunday mornings. And then I sang in the children's choir, and then my voice changed. And that was a catastrophe because what had been a rather, if I may say so myself, a pretty boy sound just became the most appalling adult sound you can imagine. So I knew I wasn't going to be a singer ever. And this idea of being an accompanist and a coach became more interesting. And the choir director said to me, well, yeah, you don't sound very good anymore, Craig, but I think it's time for you to become the choir accompanist. So that's how I started doing that. I went to a rather Tony private boys' school up in New Haven. It wasn't a boarding school, it was a day school called Hopkins Grammar. And the music teacher there was a very wise and a very kind guy called Herbert Richmond. And he immediately picked me out on the first day of school and said, okay, I'm going to need you to be accompanying the men's choruses and that sort of thing. So I started getting a lot of experience doing it then. That's how all of that started.
And at what point did you hear an orchestra in the piano? In other words, if you were playing, I don't know, let's say you might hold an Abendstern from Tannhäuser for the baritone, and obviously Wagner didn't write it for piano, he wrote it for orchestra.
Mm-hmm.
You and James Levine and most of the great pianists I know who have accompanied singers, who perform with singers, bring the orchestra to the music rather than just the piano score. Do you remember when you first heard the orchestra and the piano?
Well, it would have been on the radio. I remember it would have been a Die Walküre. And that was exciting beyond belief. So that started waking up new pistons in the brain. Yeah, it started when I was about 10 years old, I have to say. I wasn't very successful at it, now that I think back, until the 1970s when I began studying with people like John Wustman, Jeffrey Parsons, Martin Ezep. They were able to help me bring a more orchestral sound, or at least be aware of trying to bring a more orchestral sound to playing the piano. Sure. Does that answer the question, or have I missed it?
It does. And how did you get your first professional gig or gigs that led? Did you, for example, say to yourself, I need to get to Europe to learn and have experiences, or did someone invite you? How did that happen? Because I too went early to Europe, but I picked myself up and went. And sometimes people get invitations.
Okay. I'm writing about it now in a short book of memoirs. It's not a memoir book, it's a tribute to people who have helped me and to whom I'm extremely grateful through my life. It's going to be very slender, not because there weren't so many people, but it's just a bunch of stories. It was Fridolin Wagner, one of the granddaughters of Richard Wagner. And I think everyone who's listening to a Fred Plotkin broadcast will know this already, but Fridolin, of course, was the anti-fascist, the really strong anti-fascist of the family, who left Germany in 1939 and via Switzerland went to the UK to was not a prisoner of war, but what do you call them, a non-resident alien for the UK, and eventually made it to the States. Her mother, Winifred Wagner, who ran Bayreuth after her husband Siegfried's death in 1930, had a German...
And who was British.
Who was British by birth, yes, exactly. In the First World War, she was a resident alien as well, and had to report to the police once a week. She was an extraordinary woman, both for good and bad. When the Wagner family had a doctor, I can't remember his name, but he was what I guess they say nowadays in practice with, he shared office space with a Dr. Fritz Rutenberg, who was a distant cousin of my father, very distant. After Kristallnacht, he was taken off to Dachau, and she got him out. She got the Jewish doctor out, and he was then able to get out of Germany and eventually make it to New York. So we do this distant connection with the Meshuggah Verkachte Wagner, okay? There was a lady in New Haven called Helen Craybill, who was the wife of a mathematics professor at Yale. And she was one of those unfortunate ladies who had been married too young and had not been able to realize her artistic ambitions, which were great. And finally, she was able to, with her husband's blessing. She was a great opera fan, and she would come into New York 3 or 4 nights a week. She was also a huge fan of Birgit Nilsson. And in 1965, there was going to be a new production of The Ring at Bayreuth by Wieland Wagner. And she was desperate to get to Bayreuth. But of course, in those days, who could get a ticket to Bayreuth? You know, you put your name on a list, and maybe 4 years later, you were lucky enough to call and say, we may have a ticket for you. That's how it worked. Well, she came into, oh, my mind's failing me, the great travel agency run by 2 German emigres, husband and wife. It's gone. Maybe it'll come.
I know he
And
was
she
okay.
yeah. If there was any way to get tickets. And they said, no. But we know you like opera and you want to work at it. Here's Friedel Wagner's number because she runs the master classes in Bayreuth.
Mm-hmm.
And those were pretty heady days. Her brother Wieland, her older brother Wieland, was very much in favor of her working in the festival this way. Wolfgang, the younger brother, hated the idea. But Wieland said, no, we have to have her here. She has to be part of the festival. We don't let her run the artistic side of performances, but according to Papa's will, she should be able to take part. So, and in those days, Friedland used to have people like Walter Felsenstein, the great director, also coming over from East Berlin. Psychologists, Jungian psychologists would come and talk about aspects of the Ring according to Jung. Astrid Varnay, who was singing at the festival, would come and coach. I mean, it was really an extraordinary time. And the level of the singers and young conductors, like Michael Tilson Thomas, who was a masterclass member, Ming Cho Lee, the lighting designer, was in the master classes. It was a pretty spectacular thing going on. So Helen wrote to Friedeland. Friedeland said, come and meet me. She used to stay at the Wyndham. Remember the Wyndham?
On 58th Street, yes.
58th Street, yes, exactly. She lived there for years and years. And she took Helen on as an experiment. And Helen went as sort of an auditor, whatever, stage director. Anyway, because of Helen, I met Friedeland, and Friedeland came to our house, and we said, "Oh yes, there's Fritz Rutenberg and your mother, blah blah blah," and back and forth it went. And thanks to Helen, Friedeland heard me play the piano. Now I was no Paderewski, I was no, but she saw there was something there, and she knew my passion for opera. particularly Wagner. So she suggested to my parents that I be allowed to come, at their expense, of course, but come to Europe from time to time and observe the classes. And then, even during the winter, come over and drive around Germany and Austria with her. And that meant, yeah, you go to a performance in Düsseldorf or you go to a performance in Bielefeld, where she had directed her first and sadly only opera production. She produced the Lohengrin there, which was very, very good. But Brother Wolfgang made sure she never had any work in Germany again. But the story is that the plot was you'd be in Bielefeld, and the next morning you get up early and you drive to Leipzig. And then in Leipzig, I would be let loose with one of the assistant stage directors or one of the tech guys. And he would take me around the house and show me things, and we climb up ladders and all. And then in the evening, you'd see a performance. And because we were the guests of the opera house, you go back to the hotel. And back in those days, the late 60s, mid to late 60s, the food in the hotel was powdered eggs for breakfast. And occasionally there'd be beef, but usually it was a horse steak.
Yep.
However, in the room, there would be real Westfälische Schinken, real ham, very thinly cut, on real black bread, and a half bottle of Russian champagne. Sekt. And that's how we were treated as guests. Up early the next morning, off to Dresden.
But wait, let me keep you in Leipzig for a second.
Okay.
At that time, when it was East Germany, and there were, Stasi, and there were all kinds of things going on. I too visited East Germany, not to the degree you did, but somewhat. And I remember that they preserved a lot of the magnificent musical treasures, even though it was under a communist controlled system, so that it was possible to hear the Gewandhaus Orchestra in Leipzig. It was possible to buy the complete works of Goethe in German for nothing, because they wanted you to have those classics. Those magnificent books published in East Germany during communism, of all the great works of German literature, poetry, and so on. You could go to the Thomaskirche and hear Bach in the place where he performed. Did you get to do any of that?
Friedel took me by the hands up to the choir, the organ loft at the Thomaskirche. And the warden looked at me and said, "Hey, was ist das? Ach, Frau Wagner, guten Tag." And she said, "Play to your heart's content."
Wow.
Yeah. Yes, books. I think it was the old East German 5 Pfennig coin. I don't think it was the 10. I could be wrong. But, you remember you weren't supposed to take any of the marks out of old Germany. And you could take a couple, because back in the days of paid toilets in America, the 5 Pfennig worked very well in a paid toilet. But they're in storage now. But I have those old red cloth-bound Wagner's Werke, which probably cost about 35 cents a piece with the exchange rate. Yeah. And every time we'd go in, I'd buy 3 more, bring them back to New Haven. I was stopped twice by the Stasi. One of them was at the border, because on a very cold night, the border guards asked Friedlind if she had anything to declare. And she was always looking for trouble, said, "Oh, just some of my grandfather's works." Well, they of course took that to mean she was taking manuscripts back.
Yeah.
And they disassembled the car, We waited in a waiting room for about 5 hours with the tiniest, smelliest space heater. She was having the best time. I kept thinking, I'm never going to see my friends at school again, you know. And of course, it was the era of Mission Impossible on TV Sunday nights. So when I got back, I had a great story to tell the guys up at Hopkins Grammar. But yeah, that sort of thing went on all the time. I bought lots of books, lots of scores.
Yeah.
It was so exciting. So
That
exciting.
is something that I think a lot of people, even younger Germans, don't know, was the degree to which the masterpieces were available for almost nothing
Nothing. 50 cents maximum for an
for
orchestral score.
extraordinary works that
It was.
are the cornerstone of a lot of European civilization.
Yeah.
And they were available to anyone in Eastern Germany if they could afford that. And it was affordable even for them.
Yes,
For
it
them.
was.
Yeah.
The other thing that was a big part of going over into the former East Zone was you had to make preparations for bribes. And the bribes consisted of oranges and bananas. And you filled up the trunk of the car with about 3 or 4 dozen bananas and 6 dozen oranges, because both were more or less unavailable in the old DDR. And you'd get to the zone, you get to the border crossing, and open the, aufmachen, all of that. You show what you had, and they'd look at you. And Friedel would say, "Well, ja, ich habe dich vergessen." And she would break off 6 bananas and 6 bananas for the 2 guards. And then 3 or 4 oranges for each. They knew who she was because she used to go back and forth all the time, whether on the way to Leipzig or Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin.
Well, not only bananas and oranges, but pantyhose and jeans, Levi jeans.
Jeans came later. Jeans
Yeah.
came a few years after that. In the 60s, it was mostly about food.
Okay. In the 70s, when I was doing this, it was pantyhose and jeans.
Yeah, sure. And they were ever so grateful. And then, of course, you brought the rest to everyone you knew you were going to see or people you may meet along the way.
Mhm.
And another thing that I remember that will never leave me is on this trip that afternoon to Altenburg before the Meistersinger. We went to a conditorei. We went for the usual cake and whipped
Cake.
cream and coffee, which you do all over Germany and Austria. And there was a very nice lady called Gisela who had been an old friend of Friedelin's. And there was a gentleman whose name I just can't remember now. And he was a scientist, I believe, but he was interested in all of this. And he asked me why I spoke German so reasonably well. And I said, well, we spoke it at home. Well, why was that? Well, because people had left Germany when 1935, 1937, and 8, and then the last bunch in 39. Ah, did they want to leave Germany or did they have to leave Germany? I said they had to leave Germany. Ah, sie mussten doch Deutschland verlassen. He said it twice.
Oh.
And it suddenly dawned on me that I was the first Jew he had ever met. He'd met African workers who'd come in. He met Vietnamese, but he'd never met a German Jew or the descendant of a German Jew. It was an extraordinary realization.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, mind you, this is still 25 years after the war ended.
Mm-hmm.
But still, there was a good deal of time.
Yeah, but in my experience, the first time I was in Europe was 1973. There was a lot of memory of the war and a lot of discussion of the war, so much so that in places like Italy and France and Germany, where I got to before I got to Austria, they would talk about the war, and you knew exactly what they meant. They didn't have to say which war.
Oh, no, of course not.
Yeah. And there was still so much tangible evidence. Where I lived in Italy, there were parts of a town that had never been rebuilt after the Second World War. And there are parts of Sicily where you still see the bullet holes that saw action in World War II as the British and the Americans swept up and tried to liberate Sicily. In Catania, you still see a lot of the damage from those battles.
Sure, which you can still see in Berlin, of course. But I
Yeah.
was going to mention too that in Leipzig, Dresden, in those days, the late 60s, the Russians left it as it was, as a
Yeah.
reminder. You could drive down streets in Leipzig, well, in both cities, and you would still see ruins of buildings. And there were a lot of pockmarked
Yeah.
ruins as well.
Um, as I've come to know you and listen to you and follow you, the descriptions that we have discovered of you up to now give a German base and a German foundation, as one would expect. However, you are quite the boulevardier, and you have an incredibly strong affinity for French culture.
Yes, I
And
do.
how did that happen and why? And then talk about what it means to feel French culture.
Okay, fasten your seatbelt, friend.
Okay.
It started because of a fascination with Gertrude Stein, which I developed in my last year of prep school. I came across Three Lives, her first novel, well, her second novel, but the first novel that people knew about, and the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. And I went, wow, I like this a lot. And I had very good English teachers up at Hopkins. One of them is fortunately, two of them are still alive. And I got to let them know about this. I'll let them know because we can watch this in replay, right? It's up on the line for a while.
Forever.
Good. I'll let them know because one guy was called William Hart. The other was called Edward Maxey, and they were both brilliant English teachers. And they were teaching us Hemingway and Fitzgerald, America. And I could see the short. Look, I'm no genius. I'm not even that clever, but even I could understand the short sentences and the beginning of the repetitions of Miss Stein and how those phrases influenced Hemingway and well, just about every great American writer in the beginning of the 20th century. So that's how it started. I went off to Georgetown as an undergrad
In Washington, D.C.
in Washington, D.C. I had wanted to go to either the conservatory in Vienna or the music school in Freiburg, where I had already studied one summer. But in those days, you got accepted sort of like in mid-September. It's not like the competition now where 6 months in advance. And the Vietnam War was on, and my draft number was 2. Yeah, Vesmia. So it was August of 1970, and a guy who had graduated from Hopkins the year before me had gone to Georgetown to study history. And he was working in the admissions department. And he was up in New Haven. We went out to see a movie one night. I remember it perfectly well. We went to see Hello, Dolly with Barbara
Streisand, yeah.
We should have said something. But anyway, we went to see Hello, Dolly.
But also starring Louis
Said,
Armstrong.
oh, don't worry. You're exactly the sort of guy we want, that they're looking for of things on the Adagio website. And I wanted to put one Louis Armstrong for the 1920s, but they didn't have it. Anyway, that's irrelevant to the story. He said, come down next week. So I got on a train, I went down, and I got accepted. And within 2 weeks, I was a freshman at Georgetown. I was studying German and Italian. Now, German I could speak already, but they put me in the grad department almost immediately. And we had Italian and all of that, but Paul Hume, who was still the critic for the Washington Post, I was a very, very powerful man in the music world, in the music criticism world, taught a class, and I took it.
Mm.
And I wrote a paper about Four Saints and Three Acts, which was the Gertrude Stein opera set to music by Virgil Thompson. And when he brought the paper, when he handed our papers back, he said, "This is good enough to be published, and you should probably go and meet Virgil as soon as you can."
Mm.
My life changed.
Yeah.
So I wrote him a note, and he said, "Come up and visit me whenever." And it turned out I was going to be visiting my parents in New Haven in about a month. So I said, "Well, I'm going to be in New Haven. Could I come in on Friday afternoon?"
And he was in New
Uh,
York
he was in New York, living at the Hotel
at the
Chelsea.
Chelsea. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, in the same apartment he'd lived in since 1940. I think we've frozen. Are we okay?
Now we're okay.
Oh, no, we're okay. Okay, great. So he was living in the same apartment he lived in since 1941 when he escaped when he had escaped from German occupied France. So I went in and he looked at me, the story on the air. It's all right. It became clear that he thought more of me in a certain way that I wanted. And we went back and forth, and he kept reaching over. And finally, after about 20 minutes, said, "Mr. Thompson, this music. When I was about 12, my father gave me a copy of one of your books of music criticism, which I read and read and read back and forth. And I just love Four Saints and Three Acts." He said, "Oh, Jesus Christ." I got up and he went into another room and slammed the door. So I thought, okay, well, at least I met the guy. And I started to walk out through one hallway to the door, and he was coming out of the next room to the same hallway, and he said, "You know, for kids, you got style and you got lots of class. Stay." And I thought, okay. He said, "I got to go uptown and see Mr. Rorem about something, Ned Rorem. I'll be back in about 2 hours, but you must stay here. All of those containers you see up on top of the books, those are the letters of Gertrude and Alice and Picasso and Stravinsky and John Houseman, and you may take them down and look at them. If any of them go missing, I know where to find you. And in the freezer, there's a bottle of vodka, and it has good. Help yourself." So he left me alone sitting on the floor in the front room of his apartment for 2 hours. And he came back and we became friends. We became the greatest of friends. But one of the first things he said to me was, "You got too much of that damn German culture coming out of you. We got to teach you something different." And I said, "Well, yeah." He said, "No, Beethoven and Brahms and Bach, that's all fine. It was like having your grandmother up in your head. You got to learn about French composers. And you drink all of those inferior German wines. We got to teach you about Bordeaux." So that's how it happened.
Wow.
So for the next 3.5 years of Georgetown, he would send me money to take the train up to New York once a month. I'd cut classes on a Friday. I'd take an early train. I'd get there by 10:30 or 11. And he'd set me to work either copying music. I learned how to copy music. He would say, "All right, well, you're working now at the piano. Play it for me." And I'd play, and he'd say, "Oh, that's all that's all wrong. Let's do something different. And I remember I Faschingschwank aus Wien. And I played about 2 pages, and he said, Stop, what edition are you using? And I said, Clara Schumann. She said, oh, she didn't know what she was talking about. Whole thing, rephrased it. And then we go shopping for groceries for Friday dinner. And he taught me how to cook, and then everyone in the world would come in for Friday dinner. It could be Lenny Bernstein. It could be Aaron Copeland. Hausman, Mildred Natwick. I mean, he was actresses, just incredible. And he thought enough of me, even in my unformed young stage, that I could be part of this. And so it was pretty amazing. Then I went out to Urbana in 1974 to study with John Wustman
In Illinois.
in Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, Illinois. And John was great, but it was a horrible place to be.
Yeah.
And when I graduated from Georgetown, Virgil had a friend of his who was a French professor upstate New York called Bob Lewis, gave me a trip to Paris. So I went for 10 days, and then I stayed 2 weeks. And then I stayed a few more days. It was in the days when you could keep changing an airplane ticket without impunity.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got back to the States, I thought, okay, I have just got to be here somehow. I've got to be here. And in the meantime, Virgil was introducing me to more and more Ravel and Debussy and Poulenc, Henri Sauquet, André Caplet, all of these French composers, and my mind was opening up, as well as the sensual side of my soul. I was responding to it all. So both John Wustman and Virgil and Paul Hume had all said at various times, we think you should probably go and study the song repertory with Pierre Bernac, who had been Francis Poulenc's musical partner.
Mm-hmm.
And most of Poulenc's output had been written for Bernac. So about halfway through my second year of being in Urbana, I thought, I was studying with John, but I didn't want a degree in accompanying. I just wanted to get back to Europe. So I wrote to Bernac, and those three gentlemen wrote to him as well. And he wrote back and very sweetly said, look, I've had a pianist called Suzy, who has played in my studio for 30 years. I can't fire her. But if you have something to live from, I'll try to find some work for you. So I begged, borrowed, stole, and I put together $1,500, which was pretty good in 1976.
Yeah.
And off I went to Paris. And he was still on vacation, but he came back middle of September. And the first day we were supposed to meet, he had a coronary, and I got hit by a car in front of the Louvre. Yes, I was basically okay. I was bruised, but nothing broken. He was in serious shape. Hey, I've come all this way. What am I going to do? And from his hospital bed, he called some of the great French singers of the previous generation. He called up Jacques Janssen, who was Pélias in the great recording of Pélias. He called Irène Joachim, who was the Mélisande in that same great recording. He called Leila Ben Sedira, who was the Ignol on that recording.
Oh, boy. The Petit Ignol.
He called a couple of other people. He said, look, this kid has come over to work with me, and I'm not going to be able to work for about a month at least. Could you hire him to play in your studio? And they all did. So suddenly, this know-nothing, know-it-all found himself in Paris working with the greatest French singers of the previous generation. It was unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
Then when he got well, he said, yeah, come play some afternoon. And I remember it was a fabulous young French mezzo with a good extension called Cécile Claude, who eventually became the singer of oratorio and recital. And we worked on L'Île Heureuse of Chabrier.
Mhm.
And then he saw I could do it. And he said, well, can you come back on Friday? Next week, can you come for 2 hours? And then eventually I was going regularly. And at the end of the afternoon, it was usually 3 to 5 or 6, he would call the housekeeper and she would come upstairs. He had a studio on the 6th floor with a winding staircase with 2 red velvet cords. I never quite figured out how Jessie Norman got up there for her coaching. He did. And the housekeeper would wheel in a tray, and there'd be Baccarat glasses, a
Mhm.
Baccarat bucket for ice, a bottle of scotch, unsalted nuts, and Japanese rice crackers.
Yeah.
We'd sit there, and he explained French culture, French music to me. I would just say, I don't know. I would say Louise de Villemorin, and Louise. And he would go for the next hour. Just go and go. And that was my education.
Craig, I'm fascinated by what you say. I identify and connect with a lot of it, but you prompted a question in my head as you spoke. I want to make the question clear for listeners because I know you'll understand the question. These figures, whether Virgil Thompson, you name them, who are important figures, some of them became important figures early on. Some of them became obnoxious. Some of them had no tolerance for, I'll use the word bullshit,
Mhm.
for phoniness and so on. All of them very, very busy people with a lot of demands on their time and their focus and their concentration. Many of them with the great desire to have time on their own to create their art, to do their art, to rehearse, to study, whatever they did. And yet they would identify people such as yourself, occasionally people like me, who they felt needed attention, grooming, education, knowledge. Um, what drives that? What makes these people feel they have to do that?
Look, I'm nowhere on the level of these greats that we've spoken about. But it must be the same thing that when a young singer or pianist comes to me now, I feel I'm absolutely obliged to pass on as much of what I've learned over these past 50 years as was generously passed on to me. Uh, Elisabeth Söderström, the great Swedish soprano, after she stopped singing, ran Drottningholm, the Royal Theatre outside of Stockholm, for several years. And we were talking one day. I speak passable Swedish. She spoke very good English. And I remember Elizabeth starting to lecture me and making a mistake in English, but correcting herself and going on. And she said, Craig, we are absolutely obligated, no, obliged to
Yeah.
pass on all that we have learned and never forget that. And she was right. She was absolutely right. I remember when Regine Crespin was just starting to teach. It was when I had first moved to Paris. And she said, oh, les élèves au conservatoire, qu'est-ce que je vais faire? Oh. And I said, come on. You sang with everyone, every great one. You worked with Wieland Wagner as a stage director. You worked with Karajan even as a stage director. You have to pass this on, and it will keep you going. And it did. It kept her going, and she turned out to be a fabulous teacher.
She was.
I I remember when America's own and absolutely unique mezzo-soprano, Joyce Castle, who just retired from teaching in University of Kansas in Lawrence
Kansas.
just this
Yeah.
year. What's it, 20 years ago now? She was still busy singing all over the world. She was at the Met, she was at City Opera, she was going back to France, you know, and she got this offer to teach. And she said, it spells the end. It's a death wish. And I said, oh, no choice. It will keep you going for another 19 years. But,
Mhm.
and she became a fantastic teacher.
Yeah.
Great artists have that obligation to pass on everything they learned. Once again, I'm not calling myself a great artist, but I learned a lot, and one must pass it on. And I think in the case of a Bernard, a case of a Crespin, Irene Joachim, it's that curiosity to keep everything alive and please keep it going. So, please God, don't let it be forgotten by a generation, because if it gets forgotten, it's dead and it will never be back.
I refer to that as the blackout, and we saw that in dance, in ballet, about 25 years ago. And I don't think that ballet has ever fully recovered, that we can understand from videos and documentation the tradition, but the oral tradition, the touch of showing how the back should be held and whatever, that in ballet, there's been a blackout. I think that in opera and vocal music, um, there have been transitions. I won't call it a blackout, but there has been a change of aesthetic that's come through the use of HD, where the visual is more prominent, where social mores have meant that the attitudes expressed in a song, in a lead, in an operatic role, we see them differently. We younger people than we are see them differently. When I may have seen them and have been taught them by the Crispins and, in my case, the Tito Gobis and so forth, and the Giorgio Strellers. I think that's where the change is. Before you comment, I want to say something else. I'm always asked, what was the best opera performance you've ever been to, the best this or that, the best movie, the best novel, the best dinner? And I always sidestep those answers, but I can tell you that the best vocal recital I ever went to, without question, was in Alice Tully Hall, maybe 30, 35 years ago, with Elizabeth Soderstrom and James Levine.
Oh,
And it was on Mother's Day. And she picked, maybe he joined in, but she picked 24 songs by 22 composers on the theme of motherhood. And they were wonderful. And I took my mother, and it was, it was a one-time recital that they created for that moment, not to be repeated. And I hope in some way, somewhere in Lincoln Center, they have a recording of that, because it was a remarkable recital, not because they did the towering peaks of the Lieder repertory, but because they were such in sync as artists with one another and enjoyed the music making.
mhm. Everything Elizabeth touched on the stage, whether operatic concert or recital, brought our lives up to a much higher level with her planning and her generosity.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that. And off stage, may I tell you another story of just walking home
Sure,
one from a restaurant
sure.
with Elizabeth? Uh, she was here working with the young artists. It was in the days when I was in charge of the musical side of the young artist program at the Met. Larry Stayer was still in charge of the whole umbrella thing, but I was doing the music. And we had money, and Larry understood, and we had Crespin coming in, we had Söderström and all. Anyway, it was her last night in New York. And Ray Quinn, who used to run the rehearsal department, and I said, okay, where do you want to go to dinner? And she said, Aquavit. and she was a Swedish restaurant. And we said, why? You're going home tomorrow. She said, oh, the food is much better here than it is at home. So off we went. And we had a very good meal. And it was a chilly night. And she said, let's walk back. She was staying at the Mayflower. Well,
61st and Central Park West.
yep.
Yeah.
And we got about halfway there. And suddenly, I guess if you have to edit this out, you could block it for the future. But to our present day today audience, I hope you enjoy it. We're walking along, and there was a series of older women standing on the street in fur coats. They also
On 57th Street and 6th Avenue?
No, before, much before.
Okay.
Much before. And they all sort of look like Maureen Stapleton in their grandmother's furs. And later turned out that there was a market for older ladies of the night, which I had never heard about before. Ray didn't know either. And we're walking along. And of course, the rudest possible suggestions start being made to Ray and me by these ladies of the night. And I thought, oh, dear Lord, what are we going to do? Ray's eyes were going in circles. And we walked past about 5 of them. And Elizabeth turned around and said, I'm terribly sorry, ladies, but these gentlemen must come home and help me with the baby now. Good night. We just all howled.
The reason I asked 57th and 6th Avenue is many of them congregated there, these much older prostitutes.
Yes, exactly.
And they all congregated in front of the building where the tenor Franco Corelli lived. And I knew Corelli. Yes. It was on the southeast corner of 57th and 6th. It's a white building. It's still there. And Café de la Paix, no, not Café, it's a French cafe is underneath it. And he used to complain to me that he couldn't get into his own building because he was being asked women my own age wanting to have sex with me.
Well, they eventually spread out down the
from 57th Street.
The end of the story is, as we got closer to 57th Street, there was a homeless man who came up to us. And he said, give me some money for food. And I thought, what do we, and Ray said, oh my God, what are we going to do? And he got very physical and he started to push his way in. And Elizabeth said very quietly, don't worry. And she started to sing the Jenny Lind Echo song in Swedish, which has an echo. And it was like, Som jag sjunger för visa, oh, 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 oh. And this guy looked at her and he had a look in his eyes like, holy shit, she's crazier than I am, and just took off and walked in the other direction. That's how the evening ended.
Since you mentioned Regine Crispin, about whom you and I think could speak for hours, I would just want to mention one thing about her. She was a fabulous artist, the sexiest woman in the world. Incredibly intelligent, no BS again, but also very principled. But one of the things that she taught me in French, but we were talking about Dialogues of the Carmelite, Dialogue des Carmelites by Poulenc, which the Met did in English initially and then later in French. And she sang it both in English and in French, and her English was better than any of the native speakers. And she said, I'm going to teach you something, Frédéric, that you must always remember. And my accent is not so great. Il faut vivre la langue. You must live the language. And by that, she meant that if you're doing Dialogues of the Carmelites, not Dialogue des Carmelites, Dialogues of the Carmelites in English, You must live the English language that you are speaking, singing, reciting. That if you are doing any kind of role or reading a poem or reading a newspaper article in English, you must live that language. And she never defined, and I didn't ask her to define what she meant by live the language, but this is one of the maxims that I've carried with me more than just about anything else that I've learned in my career in the arts, that when I'm in Germany, du musst die Sprache leben. In Italiano devi vivere la lingua. In other words, you have somehow you have to not just in your head translate, you have to completely go into that language and the world of that language, not just the pronunciation, but the assumptions, the physicality, the emotionality. And so now that I've said that to you from Crispin, if she were to have said that to you, and maybe she did, how would you interpret Il faut vivre la langue?
Well, I knew what she meant from a fairly early age on because I'd been so lucky to be spending time in Germany. But kids, I don't teach at any of the big schools here, but I sometimes get to work with some of the kids who are at Juilliard or Manhattan. And, I say, what's your experience with French or German, whatever? And they say, well, I've had a year or I've had 2 years of diction coaching. I said, yeah, that's nice. But until you get yourself over to whatever country you choose for at least 3 months in the summer, or ideally longer for a full semester, you're never going to have a clue how to speak the language. And right now, if you're studying Italian, I'm going to recommend to you this movie of Fellini, that movie of Fellini, this movie of De Sica, this, you know, and this is your homework. You're going to go and you're going to watch and you're going to imitate, and you watch how the sexes interact. If you don't have that, you don't stand a chance in hell of coming close to what was needed. Now, Regine, of course, was a very earthy lady, and
Yeah,
she loved life.
yeah.
So she knew the nitty gritty of New York, Chicago, and San Francisco just as well as almost any native. I'm going to stop there. But
Mhm.
yeah, she was absolutely right.
Yeah.
Whether she sang Madame Flora in English and she sang Dialogue of the Carmelites in English. She knew what she was doing, whether she was doing a huckster, fraud fortune teller, or a nun who had dedicated herself to Jesus and was now afraid of dying. She knew about life.
That opens a whole enormous window when you and I and people who do what we do work with younger musicians and singers about knowing about life. I was talking the other day with a colleague of ours whom you certainly know, who is one of our great artists, and she fully understands what underpins all the roles that she has sung. And she doesn't have to describe every moment of the, let's say, Salome, of the character that she's performing, but she gets these characters because she understands life. And I feel, unfortunately, that a lot of our younger people, for one reason or another, tiptoe around the dirty stuff of life and therefore have more trouble being convincing, playing operatic characters who are not pure as the driven snow, who are not happy, who are not politically correct. And but we're not necessarily allowed to teach that.
No, not anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, I would love to be attached to a big school, a major school where the real talent is, but I wonder if I can keep my mouth shut. I really do, because so much of what we have to give these talented kids is down to the nitty gritty of life. I just thought of one more Christmas story, and it will give the listeners an idea of what a woman she was. One night we were coming back from dinner in Paris, and she had a marvelous house that was on a private street off of Pigalle. Now, everybody knows what Pigalle is in Paris. And
Well,
you
you better
had to,
tell, because maybe not everybody knows.
well, let's just say at the end of World War II, the American soldiers who knew about it immediately used to refer to it as Pig Alley.
Yeah.
It was a, it was the congregation point. Oh my God, people are going to say Rutenberg and his prostitutes again, but it's where the ladies of the night congregated.
Yeah.
And to get into this street, which was on a winding hill, there was a big iron grate, and you had to have a special key to get into it. And indeed, if you were going to visit anyone who lived there, you rang a bell, and a concierge came out with an enormous key and opened it from the inside. I always felt like I was on the set of Dialogue at the Carmelites when I went there for that. Anyway, we had been out to a neighborhood restaurant, which had a specialty of foie. And we were even arm in arm. And one of the women was standing against, very close to the gate, against the wall. And she said, "Ah, Madame Regine, un moment." And she said, "Ah, Louise, comment allez-vous?" I mean, Regine knew the girls' names. And Louise said, "I wanted to thank you for being so nice to me and the rest of us girls for so long. I wanted to let you know that I'm retiring now." And Regine, "Oh, but are you going to be all right? You know, how are you going to make money? How are you?" And she said, "No, don't worry. I've been very wise. I put some money aside, and my brother has helped me invest." I mean, that's France for you.
Yeah.
Such wise people, you know. Go get a checkup every month. Your health insurance is paid for. Put money aside. And Christmas and Regine said, "Well, you've always been," what I think she calls her a shining light to the neighborhood. I think that's what. And she said, "Merci, Regine." And then we went through the gate. A woman she was. That's what she brought to all of her roles. And if you can't explain this kind of humanity to these kids who are full of talent, and they are, the
Yeah.
talent is real. I don't know how to explain life, music making, and getting on the stage otherwise. I just don't know.
I would have said to Regine Crispin or to the prostitute, now you can teach.
Brilliant. Brilliant.
But, you know, what we're talking about is a very serious issue, because what these great artists, these composers and librettists and then poets and so forth, and novelists and playwrights and painters and so on, deal with and dealt with in their work is human nature, human behavior, who we are. And no one's perfect. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't aspire to be better humans and better to one another,
Sure.
especially. But if we're playing a role, I mean, if we're playing the four villains in Les Contes d'Hoffmann, the Tales of Hoffmann, you don't summon your good side to do that. You can't.
Never.
Because there's a malevolent Scarpia. I mean, there are many roles that just summon the worst in human nature.
Yes.
Without comic relief. I mean, I'm not a big fan of Meistersinger, but even the bad guys in that have comic elements to them.
Working with these two extremely talented baritones at the Mariinsky these days on Beckmesser, I said, the audience has to like you. You have to be a real human being. You simply cannot just be a stencil or a sketch of a cartoon character. You know, come on, guys. You've got to be a human being, and we all have our good and we have our bad sides. I remember some years ago in Chicago, Håkan Hagegård was preparing Scarpia. And he said, "Can I just sing it through for you?" I said, "Yeah, sure." So we
Say
sat.
who he was is. I loved him. I
Oh,
love working
Håkan
with
Hagegård was, if you're old enough, the most delicious papageno in
the
the
best.
Ingmar Bergman film.
Yeah,
And he had a huge career in all the major opera houses of the world. Tall, handsome, wonderful baritone,
very sweet nature,
very sweet natured.
who at a certain
And
point, I'm saying parenthetically, created a retreat in Sweden for performers who are having mental health and emotional issues.
exactly called, it is a pun on his name, Hagegård. Hage's Garden.
Yeah.
Anyway, we sang through it. And I looked at him, he said, yeah, I know. He's going to be a very nice Scarpia. It's your decision.
Yeah. But I mean, Craig, there's so much more I want to ask you about, but I'm just going to get to a couple of things. Well, the genesis of this particular program that I do, Fred Plotkin on Fridays, began when our mutual friend Thomas Hampson asked me to be a guest on his show, which was then called Tom on Tuesdays. Now it's Tom on Thursdays. And I heard the alliteration when he asked me. And even before I said yes, I said, okay, Fred on Fridays. And it was born in the worst part of the beginnings of the COVID-19 pandemic in April of 2020, when we were all locked in. And Tom and I have been friends for decades, so it's not that he approached me out of the blue. But when I created the show, April 24th, 2020, Tom was my first guest. And then I had Christine Gerke and Ben Hepner and Ferruccio Furlanetto and Julia Bullock and lots of wonderful people at the very beginning when we were all locked in. And then the show evolved. So now a lot of what I like to do is document people such as yourself who are great musicians and people in our field who are not necessarily known by everyone. Tom and you, but Tom, I'm singling him out here, is known, of course, for his Mahler and his German repertory and so on, and he's done Italian and French roles. But he's also a great advocate for American song and American music. And you and Tom have collaborated, and you have with other artists, Suzanne Menser, among them. She was my guest in July on the show, July 2023. Talk about, you spoke about Virgil Thompson, but talk about, I hate the word, but I'm going to say it, American classical music, and why people elsewhere don't take it seriously, and what American classical music is.
Okay, I'm going to paraphrase Virgil. So someone asked him, what's an American composer? He said, well, you get born in America and then you sit down with paper and pen and you write music. And that's what it is. He said, when I write music, I go back to my Southern Baptist roots. When Aaron or Lenny write music, they go back to their Jewish roots. They write music with rhythms and tonalities they heard as children. It could be, as Virgil used to call it, a darn fool ditty like Jimmy Crack Chord and I don't care, Jimmy Crack Chord and I care. Or it could be Hatikva, or, it could be anything. It's the music that penetrated your soul as a very young person and gets into you. We all learn to speak English in a certain way. We can all develop affectations, but at some point, the way we spoke as young people always comes back out again. And it's the same with music. That's what American music is. If non-Americans don't want to like it, screw them. It's their loss. I mean, if they're not intelligent enough to see what it is. You were talking earlier about Schubert. Let's talk about Schubert. Let's talk about Brahms. Listen to their music. You constantly hear German folk songs in it. Everything comes from a folk song.
Mahler as
Now,
well.
more than ever, and it is his case, not only is it German folk song, it's klezmer. Talk about a duo. Dear God in heaven. Yeah. And that's why Tom has been so fantastic, because he sings the music that comes from the souls of these composers. And he's put it out there more than anyone, than Phyllis Curtin, Don Graham, John DeGaetani, Charlie
Marilyn Horn.
Ressler, all did years and years and years ago. Excuse me, nothing against Marilyn, but she did sing some Stephen Foster.
Yeah.
She was not like Phyllis Curtin or
Okay.
John DeCai, who commissioned works.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she did her part, and God knows, with that glorious sound and her intense musicianship, she did wonders. But those other singers commissioned works right and left, from Aaron, from Virgil, from Ned, from David Diamond. You can keep going and keep going. They kept it. They kept that music alive. And after them, Tom was the first one who really. No, that's a lie. I'm sorry. Sandy Sylvan did his bit too.
Mm-hmm.
But Tom
Baritone.
had a
Yeah.
bigger international presence.
Yeah. So you're from Connecticut. Charles Ives was from Connecticut.
Uh-huh.
Explain.
When I was an extremely uncoordinated, hopelessly unathletic kid at Hopkins Grammar School in 1965 to 1970, it turns out that Charles Ives had also been a student at Hopkins Grammar a few decades before I arrived. And I would be running around the football field about 200 feet behind all the other guys, it would just be chicka, chicka, chicka. And this fat little kid would be going, "Ruh, ruh, ruh," and the coaches would be going, "You could do it, Rutenberg. You could do it. Charles Ives did it here. You could do it." Boy, were they wrong. But I tried. I really tried my best. And it, getting to play Ives songs for people like Tom Hampson and Jerry Hadley was one of the greatest gifts bestowed on me by Mother Nature. Uh, on YouTube, you could find a recording, a performance of Jerry and me performing the circus band of Ives. I'm particularly proud of that. I think it went very well. But there's a line in it: Cleopatra's on her throne. Well, I remember my grandfather and his buddies, who, when I was a teenager, were in their 80s, and said, "Do you remember when we go to the Danbury Fair and Cleopatra would come to?" And I'd say, "Cleopatra." They said, young one, she was Cleopatra." And I remembered that a voice teacher at the University of Illinois, when I was studying with John, his name was William Bill Miller. He was Nathan Gunn's teacher, damn good teacher. And he always referred to Cleopatra. He was the same age, pretty much. And I said to Jerry, "Cleopatra's on her throne." I said, "No, I promise you, the kids, the old guys, the geezers in New Haven in Connecticut called her that." And we did it in a rehearsal. And I said, "Whoa, what?" And I said, "No, that's what they called her." And he said, "Well, we got to do some linguistic research." I said, "I'm the linguistic research. I knew these guys in their 80s. They all say Cleopatra. Leave us alone." And Jerry sings Cleopatra there. There's another song about a pianist at the
And by the way,
Louvre.
Jerry Hadley was from Illinois.
And Jerry is from Illinois. Exactly. Yep. That's how he came to Urbana.
Yeah.
There's another Ives song. Once again, the gray cells are failing me, but anyone who knows Ives will know it. And it takes place at the Lowe's Poli Movie House in New Haven, Connecticut, where I used to go with my grandfather until December of 1959, when they closed it down. And the last show that they did, the last movie they showed was Third Man on the Mountain of Walt Disney with James MacArthur and Janet Monroe. We went to see it 3 times because I love the movie so much. But they used to have a piano player, and there was a pianist called George something, and he was famous for smoking a cigarette with the New Haven newspaper on the music rack, playing, watching the screen, reading the newspaper, puffing away, and then turning the page while playing the piano. And it's all there in the introduction to the song. I mean, when I think of these things, my heart gets so sentimental. And my great uncle Fritzy Keneal was still alive when I first learned the song. And he said, "Oh, George, I remember him. He had this act that he used to do, smoking away, puffing, turning the man, never missed a note." So
I
that's
want
eyes.
listeners to know, I know that you've now fallen in love with Craig Rutenberg, that he left us a wonderful list of musical selections from the Adagio catalog that you can find attached to the show page: Lehar, Poulenc, Chabrier, Rimsky-Korsakov, Brahms, and Ives, and among others. And you can find a lot of Craig's work there. Craig, I began this conversation with you, my friend, describing you as a musician's musician. Another person who I thought of that way died in July of 2023. That was Tony Bennett.
Wow.
And I was thinking about him when he died, that his interviews were not always that compelling when asked to speak about himself. You are, but he would quickly turn the conversations to other musicians, and how Ella Fitzgerald did this, and how Harold Arlen intended that, and how Frank Sinatra told me this, and how I learned this from opera and that from Rosemary Clooney, and basically the way Aretha Franklin described from these roots. And he did the same thing. What did you think of Tony Bennett?
I adored him. And when the news of his death broke the other night, I thought that's the end of a great school of American popular singing.
Yeah.
Uh, First of all, generosity of the soul, real heart, impeccable musicianship, always in tune, always in tune. Like Frank Sinatra, a perfect legato, and never a word or an emotion that you didn't understand. We had some pretty great singers from the 40s on, and that's the end of it.
Um, Sorry, I was going to say that in the New York Times, there were a lot of descriptions and assessments. They referred to him as a baritone. I always thought of him as a tenor.
I did too.
Yeah,
Let's consider him like Thomas Hampson, a baritone with a great extension.
great extension. Did you ever meet him or hear him?
I heard him live. I never met him, I'm sorry to say. Uh, but I met some of his fans
Mm-hmm.
one afternoon. Uh, Mr. Hampson and I had given a Sunday afternoon recital in Princeton in that wonderful recital series at MacArthur Hall.
In New Jersey. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was a damn good recital, if I may say so. And afterwards, we were in a dressing room. It was one of those places where there were 2 dressing rooms separated by some space, and it was knocking on the door of Tom's dressing room. So we went, and I think there were 4 ladies of a certain age, and they said hello. And Tom, of course, greeted them with all of his charm, expecting them to say something fabulous about the recital. And they said, "We enjoyed the recital very much, but you know who was here last night? Tony Bennett." And Tom said, "Oh," I said, "he was fabulous. So bye," and off they ran.
Um, about
And I
20
remember
years
Tom,
ago,
looking at me saying, "Well, baby, I guess we'll never live it up to Tony Bennett."
about 20 years ago, maybe a little more, I was hired international people won't know this name, but you will. There was a journalist, a very important journalist in America named Cokie Roberts. And she was on National Public Radio and ABC News, and she was a fantastic journalist. And she and I and a couple of other people were brought to Rome to speak at a conference. And the conference was held for mostly Americans who got a trip to Rome, in effect. And it was a very posh thing. And I spoke mostly about music, but also about Italian food. And Cokie Roberts spoke about American politics. And at that time, her mother was ambassador to the Vatican. So this would be the Bill Clinton administration, so longer ago. And she and I were told that Italy's greatest singer was going to be appearing that night as a surprise at the concert that would be given. And as you know, Craig, I was a very close friend for many years of Luciano Pavarotti. And I called him up and I said, "Are you in Rome?" He said, "No." I said, "Are you singing in Rome tonight?" He said, "No." And I said, "Well, they announced that Italy's greatest singer is going to be appearing." And he said, "Well, that's very nice, but it's not me." And, Morella Freni was not there, and a couple of other names I thought of, and Mina, who was a great pop singer, and so on. And so, I wanted to be surprised. And I had my seat in the audience next to Cokie Roberts, and I said, "Who do you think it is?" She said, "I genuinely don't know, because, Pavarotti, and you named all the names." And the curtain opened and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, special for you and everybody at the conference, Italy's greatest singer, Mr. Tony Bennett."
Oh,
And it was Tony Bennett, who had been flown in from New York and kept completely hidden in the hotel where we were all working at the Hilton. And they heard over Tony Bennett. So I got to meet him after. And I said, "Did you know that you were Italy's greatest singer?" He said, "No, I had no idea. I thought it was Pavarotti."
it's a great story. There you go. I mean, in his repertory, he was as great a singer as Luciano was.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You know,
Craig Rutenberg, you are great. I'm so happy that we were able to have this conversation. And I've loved your work for many years. As I said, I did not ever think to talk about the opera quizzes, but I'm glad I thought of it, because we documented a lot of American opera history that normally doesn't get discussed. And my audience got to know you, which I'm very happy for, because you're a treasure. So thank you very much, Craig.
thank you once again for the invitation. Thank you for all the exaggerated kind things you say about me. If I've helped explain a little bit what I do as a coach and an accompanist and what my colleagues do, then all the better. If there have been some amusing stories, I'm very happy for that. And of all of the selections that I chose from the recordings, they're all of people who have greatly influenced the way I think about voice or making music, especially the two non-singers, the violinist Miriam Soloviev and the pianist Julius Katcher.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Craig. Keep making music.
I'll do
I
my
love
best.
that term. All right, one more last question. Lagniappe, as they say in French. What does it mean to make music?
To take the dots and the spots on the page and somehow try to bring them to life in a way that it sounds like there are no constraints that you see on the page. When you look at the page, there are all of the composer's indications. And you have to go from there as the basic blueprint. But then the idea is to get it off the page so it becomes a unique living thing in the moment. that inspires, that gives joy, that brings sorrow, that does all the things music you can do, and know that in 5 seconds after the music is ended, that's never to be repeated again.
Mm.
The really fabulous Dutch soprano Ellie Ameling, who sang mostly oratorio and songs for her career, said something so fantastic one day. She said, I realized what I controlled the day that it occurred to me that there's silence. I take a breath, I make a sound with a syllable, and that becomes another sound with a syllable, and another one, and another one, and another one, and then it ends, and there's silence. And then I again take a breath, and I start the whole process again. She said that was the day I became a singer and a musician. And I hope that's how I explained it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. I don't eat very much these days, but I think we should meet and I'll have a quarter of a plate of pasta and bring the rest home.
Very good. With
Sound
pleasure.
good?
Okay.
Thank you very much, Fred. Take care. And Johann in Berlin, thank you for your help. Tausend
Thank you,
Dank.
Craig.
Be
Danke,
well.
Johann.